All right. I want to talk a little bit more now about neuroanatomy basics. But first, let's take a step back and think, how did the brain develop this architecture that it has? And I'm going to leave this in the slides, but we won't cover this here. You can go find it online. But I like to think, we'll play this and talking, right? About development as this process that sort of underlies everything, because that's, I guess, who I am, right? And so you can see here, this is actually a zebrafish embryo as it's developing from one cell to many cells. Now it's going to form a whole ball of cells, and eventually it'll form this sort of long snake-like thing that sort of starts to look like a fish. And taking too long, here we go. And then you can see up here as it sort of widens on one end, it begins to fold, and this is what's going to become the brain, right? And along this, you can see a line along the back. That's the spinal cord. It's actually right here, right? So I like this video because it shows that basically we all start out as these sort of tubes, basically, right? We go from a ball of cells to the long tube of cells, and then that tube at the front end, the anterior end, where our head is going to start folding up a bunch, and that's going to be what the brain is. And this is a sort of a video that I think shows that pretty nicely. This is again a zebrafish embryo, and you can see as it's sort of smushing up here at the front, it can start as a tube. These are actually the eyes. They basically start as sort of squishy bits that get pushed out of the brain. And then you can see this is the spinal cord into the brain, and now it's just sort of folding on top of each other in ways that are going to come those different segments of the brain. I know we're used to looking at the brain. It's got all these wrinkles. Those wrinkles end up being important. And we have sort of bigger wrinkles that make whole sort of sections of the brain, and smaller wrinkles that make sort of different fissures and things too. Right, so this is the idea here. If we're looking at this from human development, right, at about 25 days, we are this basically this tube, right? And at this point already, we can divide it into three big sections. The forebrain, which in the human is going to be sort of the king, right? The hindbrain, which is the back of the brain, this is sort of evolutionarily the most old, and in human is a relatively small part, and the midbrain that connects it. And this midbrain is always sort of weird because some of the parts get thrown in the hindbrain sometimes and some into the forebrain. But the main idea here is that you're going to have this tube, and it's going to start to fold on top of each other until you see here that the sort of yellow forebrain eventually kind of covers everything. It's going to be basically what we talk about as the cortex, and then the hindbrain gets sort of squished up into a bunch of little wrinkly bits underneath there. I'm going to show this, and we're not going to talk about this for now, but this will be our first graph that we're going to look at as a class, and I'll post this, and you can sort of interpret it as you think it will. Right, so if we start at the cortex as part of that forebrain, we know it's divided into four lobes. The frontal lobe, which is sort of the advanced section. Remember, this is where that prefrontal cortex is that I talked about earlier. We also have motor function and motor planning. The motor cortex is going to be in this little strip here. Next, we have the parietal lobe, this sort of purple section. Sensory information is going to be here, somatosensation happening right here, right behind where the motor cortex is, behind the sylvian fissure. And then at the back is the occipital, purely dedicated to vision. And on the side here, I always think of these as little T-Rex arms as sort of the brain, is the temporal lobe. Think temples, that's where that comes from, right? And this is sort of a grab bag of different things. It can do a bunch of different things, but sort of auditory information comes in there. Language is there in the form of Wernicke's area. And an integration of memory into perception, which can mean a bunch of things, but a lot of sort of important parts of memory are there. The cerebral cortex has two hemispheres. If we think about it in terms of remember if we're cutting down the sagittal plane from earlier, we have a left and a right hemisphere, largely doing the same things. There's a few things that are specific to certain sides, like Wernicke's area and Broca's area are both predominantly on the left side. These two hemispheres also are for the large part, 95%, somewhat redundant, except for they communicate the different parts of the brain. So, for example, your left motor cortex here, right, is going to control the right side of your whole body, right? And there's a part in that motor cortex that's for, say, your right hand, and it is in the left part, right? And that's the same thing with sensation here, where it crosses over. And it does, all that information is coming in a few different spots, but one of the main spots that we talk about that connects the two hemispheres of the brain is the corpus callosum. It's going to connect sort of 95% of information. The other one is the anterior commissure. So it's these two, if we think particularly about the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, they are divided in a way that we talk about sort of topographically, that there's the different part within here. So if we're looking at these, we can see that they are, there's a different part basically for each part of the body, right? And if we think for the motor cortex, if you think about it, your face has maybe not the biggest muscles, but has the most different muscles that control all those different, being able to give all the different facial features, emotion, speaking. So you can see that, for example, your face makes up a large amount of your motor cortex, whereas something like your legs and toes, here, even though that's a huge part of your body, makes up a relatively small part. And we look at it, sensationless can change a little bit. For example, your hands, which make up sort of a small part, make up a huge part of your sensation, because there's a whole lot of sensory nerve endings there, right? So forebrain, we normally talk about the main part, the cortex, but underneath there's even more forebrain. And one of the big groups there is the limbic system. Now there's a number of different parts that get thrown in with the limbic system, but the big ones are going to be the hippocampus and the amygdala, and sometimes people throw the hypothalamus in there. We'll talk more about that later. I guess cingulate cortex as well. But we're going to focus on hippocampus and amygdala. They connect to the cortex, and the big thing is that this will all be important for emotional processing. Memory as well, too. So hippocampus is sort of the memory region, but we'll learn more when we talk about learning memory. There's more to it, although the hippocampus is very key. The amygdala is as well. Now, the amygdala is not, though, thought as memory predominantly, even though increasingly they're showing it's important for memory. What we think about for amygdala, it tends to be fear, and that's sort of that emotion. And it has sort of a wide range of sort of things around fear and anxiety can be there. If we're looking further here, we see hypothalamus and pituitary. These are two regions we're going to come back to a lot when we talk about hormones and behavior, because they're really the pituitary gland down here is what sort of makes and absorbs hormones and communicates that to the hypothalamus so that we respond to them appropriately. We have some more what we call subcortical regions. That's the basal ganglia, which is made up of a number of different ones. We don't spend a huge amount of time here, but it's the caudate, the putamen, the globus pallidus, and the substantia nigra is a little bit, I guess, contentious. I don't know if anybody actually argues about this, but different books put it either in the basal ganglia or actually into the midbrain. A key thing here is this dopamine neurotransmitter, which we'll talk about later, regulates these. And if we're talking about Parkinson's disease, we're talking about basal ganglia. It's very important for sort of executing motor function. It's a sort of intermediate between the motor cortex and sort of the rest of the body, so that you get sort of coordinated motor function happen. If you think about this, that makes sense with Parkinson's disease. People have shaking, right? That's sort of discoordination, but they also have a hard time initiating and stopping moving. If you've met people with Parkinson's, they can, maybe it's real hard to get going, and then they're good for a while once they get going. That can be a very common symptom of Parkinson's disease. Also, though, and I think this is one of the things I always have a hard time with when teaching neuroanatomy, is that every brain region has something they're known for, but then they also sort of do everything else. The basal ganglia ends up playing a huge role in memory as well, and you'll notice this again. Parkinson's individual patients tend to have memory issues as well. This I think was supposed to go one bit older, but this is a great way to remember what the hypothalamus does in terms of the 4 F's of behavior. One last subcortical region, that's the thalamus. It sort of sits here, these 2 little blue eggs that are shown here underneath everything. I tend to think of the thalamus as this sort of the gatekeeper to the cortex, particularly for sensory information, but also a little bit for motor, right? Everything is going to come in through the cortex, vision, auditory, other sensory systems coming in there, and the cortex is sort of a relay that tells you should go here, or you need to go here and here, in sort of the higher functioning. And yeah, so because of this, it's often hard, very small parts of the thalamus can have key things. There's the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is part of the thalamus, that's key for vision, right? It lets all the visual information in and out, or in really, I guess. All right, so that, everything we talked about there was really forebrain, with, I guess, the substantia nigra being potentially part of the midbrain. So now we're moving back further, older evolutionary, to the midbrain. And it's a little bit hard to look at. We're not used to looking at this region, right? Because we see this big cortex. That's what we think of when we think brain. But if you look sort of deeper inside of it, we can see what is in the midbrain. So this also gives you a good idea where the thalamus sort of sits in here. And you can see where it is sort of central. And then below that, we start to get to the midbrain. Couple different parts of the midbrain. Tectum, the key here is inferior and superior colliculi that are responding to either auditory or vision. Cerebral peduncle, which is made up of the tegmentum, crucicerebrae, and again, substantia nigra, which maybe that's basal ganglia, maybe it's part of this, right? The midbrain, we don't spend a ton of time on, but besides these few specific areas, sensory motor integration at less than conscious levels, right? This is less evolutionarily advanced. The midbrain is going to be much bigger in sort of a lizard than a mammal, and so it's involved with things that are not sort of higher cognitive function. It's not going to be involved in sort of planning what you're going to do with your life. That's not the midbrain, right? That's the cortex, right? But it might be responsible for sort of quick instinctual choices you make, right? Like something hurt me, I need to react quickly. If we look at the hindbrain, so going even further back, the medulla here, that's the sort of oldest and the most basic functions are there. I like to ask a lot of questions that the answer is the medulla, because it should, if there's something so basic it's needed for life, it's the medulla, right? So what are those sort of functions? This is breathing, this is controlling your heart rate, are you getting enough oxygen, things like that. The things that, like, if you don't have this, it's not just bad, it's you're dead, right? The pons, I'm trying to see, right, the pons up here, which literally is Latin for bridge. It's sort of thought of as like the connecting the hindbrain to the midbrain. It's a relay they talk about. Again, we're looking now here. This is the spinal cord. Remember, we're all central nervous system here, and it's connecting up into the midbrain. And it's a gradual transition, right? If you were looking at it, you might not even notice that the medulla is not spinal cord. It's just a slightly widened part, and if we go up the pons, it's sort of an even bigger bridge winding out further. Sleep is the main function that gets assigned there. Cerebellum, if we look at the back of the brain, this is, again, I feel like if people have this sort of mental picture, you have this big cortex, and then you have this real wrinkly bit off the back. That's the cerebellum. The cerebellum is I think, quite interesting because it's involved in a number of different things, but the big things is sort of coordination and balance. This is what makes it so that we can walk and not look like we're stumbling all over the place. If you have damage to the cerebellum, people have something called ataxia, where they don't have good coordinated movements. This planning for motor function also ends up being planning for sort of life function, right? Throughout the hindbrain, important vegetative functions. Right, so that's what I have for you as far as sort of the real basics of neuroanatomy, and now we've skipped all this and I didn't have to talk about this in class, and you can go over it at your own speed. I think this works much better this way. I hope you're completing your study guides, and I hope this helped do that as well.